between a rock and a hard place. My father made me an offer I couldn't refuse, but he never expected me to refuse him, and then I'm Ryan 28, M. I'll never forget the way my father's voice sounded that night, carrying that same quiet authority that I had spent years trying to defy. It started with a text message. Family dinner tonight. Don't be late. I was already wary. Family dinners with Charles weren't ever casual, and they rarely happened without some underlying agenda. My father, Charles, 55, M, was known for his intense need for control, a drive that was as much a part of him as his next breath. But lately, I'd felt his eyes on me with that added pressure, like he was planning something. When I arrived, I found my parents sitting at the table, both looking somber. Madison sat beside them, shooting me a look that told me she, too, had no idea what this was about. The air was thick with tension as I took my seat, and my father cleared his throat. "We have something important to discuss tonight," he began, fixing me with a gaze that pinned me down. "Ryan, you're nearing 30, and it's time we talk about your future." I braced myself. I had known for years that Charles wanted me to join his business, a massive construction company he'd built from the ground up, but I had always dodged it. I had my own dreams, my own plans. I didn't want to be just another cog in his machine, doing his bidding while he controlled every part of my life. But this time, it seemed like my father was done waiting. "There's a significant inheritance set aside for you," he continued, "one that could set you up for life. But to access it, there are certain conditions." Of course, there were conditions. Charles never gave without strings attached. I forced myself to stay calm as he laid out his demands, his voice firm and unwavering. "I need you to sign over control of it. This way, the money stays in the family, invested in the business. In return, you'll have a monthly allowance, and you'll start working directly under me, learning the business from the ground up." My stomach twisted. This was more than just an offer. It was an ultimatum. My inheritance, something I'd thought was mine, no strings attached, was being used as a bargaining chip to keep me under his thumb. "And if I refuse?" I asked, my voice sharper than I'd intended. He leaned back, eyes narrowing. "Then you walk away with nothing." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. My mother glanced between us, her face pale. Madison shifted in her seat, biting her lip but staying silent. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for my answer. "Let me get this straight," I said, feeling a surge of defiance. "You want me to give up control of my own inheritance, the money my grandfather left for me, so that I can live off whatever you decide I'm allowed?" Charles's mouth tightened. "It's for your own good, Ryan. This family has worked hard for what we have, and I won't see it wasted on distractions." Distractions. He couldn't even bring himself to acknowledge that I had my own dreams, my own career ambitions. The distractions he was talking about were my plans to open an outdoor adventure company, something I'd been passionate about for years. In his eyes, it was just another whim, something he needed to control. I looked at Madison, hoping she'd back me up, but she just looked down, clearly torn. I knew she hated these confrontations as much as I did, but she always found it hard to stand up to our father. "Dad, with all due respect, I can't agree to this," I said, my voice steady. "I'm not handing over my inheritance just so you can keep tabs on me for the rest of my life." Charles's face darkened. "Then you'll find yourself out of the family's support." It was as simple and brutal as that. And there it was, the ultimatum. He expected me to cave, to fold under the pressure like I had so many times before. But something snapped inside me. "Fine," I said, feeling the words tumble out of my mouth before I could stop them. "If that's the way it has to be, then I'm out." The silence was deafening. My mother looked stricken, her hand trembling as she reached for her glass of water. Madison's eyes were wide with shock. And Charles. His expression was a mixture of anger and something else, something I hadn't seen before. Surprise. I don't think he ever thought I'd have the nerve to refuse him. "Ryan, don't be hasty," my mother murmured, a hint of desperation in her voice. "Maybe we can talk about this." "There's nothing to talk about," my father interrupted, his tone final. "If Ryan wants to make his own way, he's free to do so. But don't come crawling back when you realize how hard the real world is." I felt a mix of anger and hurt, but I kept my voice calm. Don't worry, I'll manage. With that, I stood, feeling the weight of my decision settle over me. I didn't look back as I walked out the door, but I could feel my father's gaze boring into my back, his disapproval like a physical weight. As I left, I knew that my life was about to change in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. I had no idea what the future held, but one thing was clear. I had finally broken free of my father's control. Or so I thought. I expected fallout from my decision. I knew it wouldn't be as simple as walking away from a family dinner and going about my life like nothing happened. But I underestimated just how far my father would go to punish me for defying him. It started subtly enough. I went to check my bank account the next morning, an account my parents had been putting money into since I was a kid, and found that it was frozen. Panic seized me as I tried to make sense of it. My immediate thought was fraud, maybe some bank glitch. But after a call with the bank, the truth was even more jarring. Your account was frozen by the primary account holder, the banker told me, sounding almost apologetic. Primary account holder? I repeated, feeling a chill. That's supposed to be me. Actually, sir, the primary account holder is listed as Charles, she clarified, and I could hear her cringe even through the phone. He's authorized to freeze the account at any time. My father. I should have known. I'd been so naive, assuming that the account was mine after all these years. I hung up, seething, feeling the sharp edge of betrayal twist in my gut. I should have known he'd use this to try and force me back into his fold. This was his way of making it clear that, as far as he was concerned, I had nothing without him. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and frustration. I kept myself busy, looking for ways to scrape by with the little savings I'd managed to keep in a separate account he hadn't touched. But just as I was wondering how I'd make rent next month, I got a text from Madison. *Hey, meet me at the park. I have something to tell you, *. I was surprised. Madison had been unusually quiet since that dinner, and I wasn't sure where she stood. But I agreed, and an hour later, I found myself sitting on a bench, watching her walk over, her face a mix of concern and determination. As soon as she sat down, she looked around, almost as if she was afraid of being overheard. I need to tell you something, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. After you left that night, Dad was furious. He started talking about consequences for you and, honestly, for me too, if I didn't stay in line. I felt a pang of guilt. Madison and I had always been close, but I hadn't thought about how my decision might put her in an uncomfortable position with our father. I didn't mean to drag you into this mess. She shook her head. No, Ryan, you didn't. I've been in this mess for a long time. I've always been too scared to do anything about it. She took a shaky breath, like she was working up the nerve to say something big. Dad's been pushing me too. Pressuring me to marry this guy, Jason. You remember him? The one Dad's business is partnered with? Jason. The name stirred a vague memory of a clean-cut guy my father had introduced to us at a family function last year. I'd barely noticed him, but apparently, Charles had much bigger plans than just a casual introduction. Wait, so he's trying to arrange a marriage for you? I asked, incredulous. Madison nodded, her expression bitter. He thinks it'll secure the family business. He wants everything locked in, controlled. And I'm so sick of it, Ryan. Hearing this, I felt a mix of sympathy and anger. My father's controlling nature went beyond business. He wanted every part of our lives to bend to his will. Why haven't you said anything before? I asked, feeling guilty for not realizing how bad things were for her. Because he always knows how to get what he wants, she said, voice cracking. He has his ways of making you feel like you'll lose everything if you don't do what he says. You saw how he froze your account. And if I go against him, I know he'll make my life miserable too. We sat in silence for a few minutes, letting the weight of it sink in. My father's power over us wasn't just financial. It was emotional too. He knew exactly how to play on our fears and insecurities. But Ryan, she continued, leaning closer, there's something else. I think Dad's hiding something. Something big. My heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? I've been noticing things, she said, glancing around again nervously. Weird things with the family assets. Accounts being moved around, investments disappearing and reappearing in different places. I've been looking at some of the business records, and they don't add up. I frowned, the pieces clicking together in my mind. Are you saying he's hiding money? Madison nodded, her face etched with worry. I don't know the full details, but it's like he's keeping certain assets off the books. And if he's willing to freeze your account over a family dispute, what else could he be capable of? It felt like I was seeing my father in a new, disturbing light. I knew he was controlling, but this was on a different level. The thought of him manipulating us with hidden assets, controlling our lives with money he was hoarding, it made me feel both angry and afraid. Do you think Mom knows? I asked, wondering if she was as trapped as we were. Madison bit her lip, looking uncertain. I don't know. Mom goes along with Dad most of the time, but she doesn't seem happy about it. I think she's afraid to cross him, just like we are. I sat back, digesting everything. My inheritance, Madison's marriage prospects, hidden assets. Our lives were like pieces on a chessboard that our father moved around at will. But knowing he was hiding money gave me a strange kind of leverage. If I could figure out what he was up to, maybe I'd have a way to stand up to him. Madison, I said, determination hardening in my voice, I think it's time we start looking into this. If Dad has been keeping money off the books, he's breaking trust with all of us. He's got to be held accountable. She looked at me, a flicker of hope in her eyes. You really think we could take him on? I don't know, I admitted, but I'm done letting him control my life. And it sounds like you are, too. For the first time in years, we shared a moment of solidarity, both of us united against the person who should have been our strongest supporter but had become our greatest adversary. Over the next few days, Madison and I carefully, quietly started looking into our father's finances. She shared what little she knew, showing me discrepancies in the records she'd found. It was like piecing together a puzzle with half the pieces missing, but we began to get a clearer picture of just how deeply our father's control ran. One night, after combing through pages of financial documents Madison had managed to photograph, we found a strange account with a series of transactions that didn't match any of the family businesses. The money was flowing in and out of it with no clear purpose, almost as if it were a private slush fund. Who's behind this account? Madison whispered, her eyes wide. I don't know, I replied, feeling a sense of dread. But I think it's time we find out. Just as I started making plans to dig deeper, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from my mother, a single line that sent a chill down my spine. Asterisk, we need to talk. Privately, asterisk. My pulse raced. My mother was the last person I'd expected to reach out. She'd always sided with my father, or at least appeared to. But now, with that one message, she was hinting that maybe things weren't as simple as they seemed. And I knew that if my mother was reaching out, there was more at stake here than I'd realized. When my mother texted me, I didn't know what to expect. My whole life, Lisa had been the peacemaker, the one who softened my father's harsher edges. But she rarely challenged him. If she disagreed with him, she kept it quiet, always finding a way to make it seem like she was on his side. So, to get a message from her saying she needed to talk, asterisk privately asterisk, was enough to make my pulse race. We met in a small cafe on the edge of town, a place where my father would never think to look. I spotted her immediately, sitting in a corner booth, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup like she was holding onto it for dear life. She looked up when I walked in, her expression a mix of relief and nervousness. As I sat down across from her, she leaned in close, speaking in a hushed voice. Ryan, I don't have much time. Your father's been difficult lately. He's paranoid, watching everyone, especially since you refused his ultimatum. The weight of her words hit me. Mom, what's going on? What does he have on you? She hesitated, glancing around as if she expected my father to appear any moment. There are things your father doesn't want anyone to know, Ryan. He's kept certain assets hidden for years, accounts that only he has access to. He's done everything he can to control us, to keep us all under his thumb. She sighed, her voice shaky. I should have said something sooner. I should have done more to protect you and Madison. Mom, it's not your fault, I said, surprised by the intensity of my own anger. Dad's been hiding money, hasn't he? She nodded, her face pale. There's a secret account, one that he's siphoned money into for years. He's hidden assets away in case things with the business ever went south. But it's not just for the business, Ryan. He's keeping it from us because he wants to hold on to all the power, to make sure we never have the means to stand on our own. A mixture of rage and betrayal surged through me. This was worse than I'd thought. My father wasn't just controlling our finances. He was controlling our lives, planning every move as if we were nothing more than pieces on his personal chessboard. Why haven't you left him? I asked quietly, struggling to understand how she could put up with this for so long. She looked away, her eyes filled with regret. I was afraid of what he'd do to us if we crossed him. And I thought, maybe it was for the best, that he knew what he was doing. She sighed, a tremor in her voice. But lately, I've started to realize that he's not just trying to protect the family. He's protecting himself, and he's willing to sacrifice all of us to keep his power. For the first time, I saw my mother not as an extension of my father, but as someone trapped just like the rest of us. She'd been living in his shadow for years, her loyalty twisted by fear and resignation. I realized then that she was as much a victim of his control as Madison and I were. Mom, we can't let him keep doing this. He's already frozen my account, and I'm worried about Madison. He's been pressuring her to marry that guy Jason to secure some business deal. My mother's face tightened. I know. He's been relentless, and Madison, she doesn't know how to say no to him. She's scared, Ryan. She's afraid of what he'll do if she stands up to him. I clenched my fists, the anger boiling up. This has to stop. We need to find a way to get to that account, to figure out exactly what he's hiding. If we can show Madison the truth, maybe she'll find the courage to stand up to him. My mother nodded slowly, her expression resolute. There's a key, a physical key that opens a safe in his office. That safe holds documents, ones I think will lead us to the account. But it's risky, Ryan. If he finds out, I'll be careful, I promised, though my heart was pounding. I'll do whatever it takes to protect us, Mom. I'm not letting him keep us under his thumb anymore. We spent the next half hour discussing the plan, going over every detail to ensure we wouldn't be caught. She told me when my father usually left the office, the times when he'd be at business meetings or out on the golf course with his partners. I'd have a small window to get in, find the key, and get out. As we parted, I felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. For the first time, it felt like my mother was on my side, like we were allies. But I knew that the risks were higher than ever. My father wouldn't take betrayal lightly. The following night, I went to my parents' house under the guise of talking things over, hoping to calm tensions. My father was out, and my mother kept watch, ready to cover for me if needed. As soon as I slipped into his office, the enormity of what I was doing hit me. This was his sanctuary, his domain, a place where he controlled every aspect of our lives. My hands shook as I searched through his desk, rummaging through papers and files until I found the small, inconspicuous key hidden in a drawer beneath a stack of business documents. I pocketed it quickly, my pulse racing, and made my way to the safe behind a painting on the wall. The safe was old-fashioned, requiring both the key and a combination. My mother had provided me with the combination, having seen my father use it countless times over the years. With trembling hands, I turned the dial, holding my breath as the safe clicked open. Inside, I found stacks of documents, neatly organized but all marked with cryptic labels. My eyes scanned the pages, and my heart pounded as I read names of accounts and offshore holdings that had no connection to the family business. This wasn't just a backup fund for emergencies. This was a hidden empire, money he'd been funneling away without anyone knowing. But then something else caught my eye, a file marked with Madison's name. I pulled it out, my stomach churning as I skimmed through it. It was a contract, an agreement between my father and Jason's family. It detailed a merger that involved not just the business, but Madison's future. He was essentially selling her off to secure a deal. Sickened, I shoved the files back into the safe and closed it, returning everything to its original place. I left the office quickly, the keys safely hidden in my pocket. My mother was waiting for me in the hallway, her face anxious. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she whispered, her eyes wide. Yeah, I said, barely able to keep the anger from my voice. And a whole lot more. We didn't speak until I was safely back in my car, the documents now tucked away in my bag. My mother and I exchanged a look, a silent understanding passing between us. We both knew that this was only the beginning, that things would only get more complicated from here. Over the next few days, I pored over the documents, trying to make sense of the accounts, the contracts, and the implications of what my father had done. The extent of his betrayal was staggering. He wasn't just manipulating us. He was actively sabotaging our lives for his own gain. But the worst part was the agreement involving Madison. My sister was being forced into a marriage she didn't want, all because my father saw her as a pawn in his empire-building game. I knew I had to tell Madison, but it was hard to find the right time. She was already under so much pressure, and I didn't want to make things worse. But one evening, I called her, asking her to meet me at my apartment. When she arrived, I could see the tension in her face, the stress of dealing with our father's demands etched in her expression. I took a deep breath and handed her the file with her name on it. Madison, you need to see this. She looked confused but took the file, her eyes scanning the pages. As she read, her face went pale, her hands trembling. This can't be real, she whispered, horror dawning in her eyes. It's real, I said softly, my heart aching for her. Dad's been planning this for a while. He's been hiding money, setting up deals that benefit only him, and now he's trying to control your life too. Tears filled her eyes, and she shook her head, as if trying to shake off a nightmare. I can't believe he'd do this. I always knew he was controlling, but this is too much. I placed a hand on her shoulder. You don't have to go through with it, Madison. We have options. I'm going to do everything I can to stop him. For the first time, I saw a flicker of resolve in her eyes. She straightened, her jaw set. Then I'm with you, Ryan. We're in this together. As she said the words, I felt a swell of determination. My mother, Madison, and I, our family had been fractured, controlled, manipulated for too long. It was time to take a stand, to reclaim our lives from the man who had once held absolute power over us. But even as I felt the strength of our newfound alliance, a dark thought lingered in the back of my mind. If my father found out what we were planning, there would be consequences. Consequences that could tear us all apart. It didn't take long for my father to catch wind that something was amiss. I don't know if it was my mother's uneasy glances around the house or Madison's sudden distance, but Charles was becoming suspicious. He'd cornered Madison one afternoon, grilling her about who she'd been spending time with, and she barely managed to deflect, saying she'd been staying with a friend. My father's paranoia was growing, and I knew it was only a matter of time before he confronted me directly. And then, one evening, he did. I was at home, trying to piece together more of the hidden accounts when my phone buzzed. It was a message from my father, demanding I come to the house immediately. I felt my pulse quicken, knowing this was it. He knew I was digging, and he was ready to confront me. I called Madison, asking her to be there too. If we were going to face him, we'd do it together. When I arrived, I found Charles waiting in his study, his expression dark, his posture tense. My mother stood behind him, her face pale, and Madison hovered by the door, watching him warily. As I walked in, the tension was thick, like the calm before a storm. Ryan, my father said, his voice hard, I'd like to know what you think you're doing, sneaking around in my affairs, digging through things you have no business touching. I met his gaze, feeling a flicker of defiance. I'm doing what I have to. You think you can control every part of our lives, but we're done letting you, he scoffed, shaking his head. This isn't a game, Ryan. You have no idea the damage you're doing, the risks you're taking. Everything I've done to protect this family. To protect us? Or to protect yourself? I countered, my voice sharper than I intended. Hiding money, manipulating us with lies, arranging Madison's marriage. Don't pretend any of this is for our sake. Charles's face darkened, his jaw clenching as he took a step closer. You've always been naive, Ryan. You don't understand what it takes to build and maintain something real, something that lasts. Don't talk down to me, I shot back. This isn't about business or building something real. It's about control, Dad. You're afraid of losing power over us, and you'll do anything to keep it, even if it means destroying your own family. His expression hardened, and I could see the anger flashing in his eyes. He looked over at Madison, his voice laced with a cold fury. Is this what you want too, Madison? To tear this family apart for a fleeting sense of freedom? Madison's face was pale, but she stood her ground. I want my life to be my own, Dad. I don't want to marry Jason, and I don't want to be a pawn in your business schemes. Charles let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head as if we were children who simply didn't understand. You think you know what's best for yourselves, but you have no idea. I've spent my life building something stable, something you could depend on, and this is the thanks I get? Ungrateful, spoiled. Enough. My mother's voice cut through the room, startling all of us. She stepped forward, her hands shaking, but her eyes determined. Charles, this is your doing. You've driven them to this. You've turned your own children against you. Charles's face twisted in a mix of anger and betrayal. Lisa, don't you dare. No, I'm done keeping quiet, she interrupted, her voice firm. All these years, I've gone along with your demands, telling myself it was for the family's good. But I can't keep pretending this is normal, that this is okay. You've crossed a line, Charles. And I won't let you destroy our children's lives. For a moment, the room was silent, each of us processing what had just happened. My mother, who had always stood by his side, who had supported him through everything, was finally standing up to him. And it seemed to shake something loose in my father. His expression shifted, a glimmer of something almost desperate in his eyes. I don't think any of you understand the position you're putting yourselves in, he said, his voice quieter but no less intense. Do you know what will happen if this family falls apart? Do you know the secrets, the deals, the sacrifices I've made to keep us where we are? I narrowed my eyes. What are you talking about? He looked at me, his eyes cold and calculating. You think you're so clever, digging through my files, trying to find things I've kept hidden. But you don't know the whole story, Ryan. You don't know what's at stake here. Then tell us, I challenged, crossing my arms. If there's so much we don't know, why don't you enlighten us? A bitter smile crossed his lips, and he looked over at my mother, as if daring her to contradict him. You want the truth, Ryan? Fine. The inheritance you're so desperate to protect? It's tainted. That money didn't come from your grandfather, not all of it. I made some deals, took some risks, and yes, I hid the money because I couldn't afford for it to be tracked. Madison's eyes widened, and my mother's face went pale. I felt a sickening sense of dread. What do you mean, tainted? What deals, Dad? He let out a cold laugh, his eyes glinting. There are people, partners, let's say, who made sure this family was set for life. But that money has strings attached, and if I lose control, they'll come looking. This isn't just a family feud, Ryan. You're messing with forces you don't understand. Madison's voice shook as she spoke. So you're saying you've involved us with dangerous people? Dangerous? He scoffed. Only if you cross them. As long as we keep up appearances, as long as we maintain control, everything stays fine. But you two seem hell-bent on throwing everything away over some misguided notion of independence. I felt like the ground was slipping out from under me. This wasn't just about inheritance or family control. This was about something much darker. My father had entangled us with people who could ruin us, or worse, if they felt betrayed. So you sold us out? I asked, barely able to keep the disgust from my voice. All for power? He didn't answer, but the silence spoke volumes. Madison looked at me, her face stricken, and I knew she was feeling the same betrayal, the same horror. You don't understand, Charles said, his voice almost pleading. This was for all of us. I did what I had to do to secure our future. If I lose control now, everything I've built falls apart. Everything our family stands for, gone. My mother's voice was barely a whisper. Charles, you should have told us. I couldn't, he said, looking defeated for the first time. If I'd told you, you wouldn't have understood. You'd have tried to interfere, just like you're doing now. I was trying to protect you. Protect us? Madison's voice cracked, her hands clenched into fists. You lied to us. You manipulated us, and now you're using fear to keep us in line. This isn't protection. It's control. And we're done letting you have it." Charles's face twisted with fury. "You don't get to walk away from this. None of you do. You're tied to this family whether you like it or not. And if you try to break away, there will be consequences." I took a deep breath, my heart pounding. I'd come here to confront him about the hidden accounts, the control he held over us. But what I'd found was something far worse, a web of secrets and deceit that went far beyond anything I'd imagined. My father wasn't just a controlling parent. He was a man who would do anything, cross any line, to hold on to his power. And now, he was telling us that leaving, breaking free, was no longer an option. "Then we'll take our chances," I said, standing my ground. "We're not going to live under your thumb anymore, and if you try to stop us, we'll go public with everything. The accounts, the offshore holdings, all of it." My father's face paled, a flicker of genuine fear crossing his eyes. He looked over at my mother, as if pleading for her support, but she shook her head, her expression resolute. "We're done, Charles," she said softly. "You've made your choice, and now we're making ours." With that, I turned to leave, feeling both a weight and a sense of liberation settle over me. Madison followed, her face determined, and my mother stayed silent, her gaze fixed on the man she had spent her life supporting, now a stranger in her eyes. As we left, I knew that we were crossing a line we could never come back from. The family I'd once known was shattered, the ties we'd held onto severed. But for the first time, I felt a glimmer of freedom, a chance to build a life on my terms, away from my father's shadow. But even as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that my father wasn't done with us yet. In the days that followed our confrontation, the silence from my father was deafening. There were no calls, no demands, not even a message from my mother checking in. It felt like my father was strategizing, figuring out his next move, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this quiet was only the beginning. Madison and I had some difficult choices to make. We could either move forward with what we had, exposing my father's hidden accounts and his dealings with the dangerous partners he hinted at, or we could walk away and try to salvage what was left of our family. I knew what was at stake. Exposing my father would mean cutting ties entirely. He'd never forgive us if we publicly revealed his secrets. But then, there was Madison. She was still reeling, feeling betrayed by a father who saw her as a mere pawn. If we chose silence, if we stayed quiet, we'd be giving up any hope of real independence. We'd still be living in his shadow, bound by his decisions. I couldn't see a future for us under those terms. After a long, sleepless night, I decided to visit my parents' house one last time. Madison agreed to come along, her jaw set with a determination I'd never seen before. My mother let us in, her face pale and drawn. I could tell she was caught between loyalty to my father and her love for us, but even she seemed to know that things couldn't go back to the way they were. Charles was waiting for us in the living room, sitting in his armchair, his hands clasped in front of him. He didn't stand when we entered. He just looked at us, his eyes cold and wary. "So, you've come to make your demands," he asked, his tone almost mocking. "What is it you want, Ryan? Money? Control of the accounts?" "No, Dad," I replied, my voice steady. "We're not here to make demands. We're here to make a choice, one you left us with." A flicker of uncertainty passed over his face, but he quickly masked it with his usual icy composure. "And what choice is that?" "We're willing to walk away," I said. "No exposure, no lawsuits, no public fallout. But we want freedom, real freedom. Madison deserves her life back, and so do I. If you try to interfere, if you ever pull anything like this again, we'll go public with everything." His mouth twisted into a smirk. "So, you're giving me an ultimatum now?" "No," Madison cut in, her voice shaking but firm. "We're giving you a chance. We could destroy your reputation, make sure everyone knows the truth about what you've done. But we're willing to walk away quietly, if you'll just let us live our lives." My father's expression was hard to read, and for a moment, I thought he might actually agree. But then his eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can blackmail me? You think you can manipulate me with threats? I've spent my life building this family, holding it together. You're nothing without me. You can't just walk away. I took a deep breath, letting his words wash over me. That's where you're wrong, Dad. We're more than what you've made us. And if we have to expose everything, we will. But it's your choice. You can keep pushing us, or you can finally let us go. Silence filled the room, tense and thick. My mother's face was drawn with anxiety, her gaze shifting between us and my father. She looked like she wanted to intervene, but she seemed to realize that nothing she could say would change the outcome. Finally, my father looked down, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice quiet but filled with venom. "If you walk away now, you'll lose everything I built for you. You'll be nothing." Madison looked at me, and I gave her a slight nod, the decision made. We both knew that this was it. We could keep fighting, keep pushing for control, or we could leave this chapter behind and start fresh. "Maybe we'll be nothing," I replied, my voice calm, "but at least we'll be free." With that, Madison and I turned to leave, and my mother took a step forward, her eyes filled with tears. "Wait, please, don't do this. We can find another way. We can fix this." I looked at her, feeling a pang of guilt and sadness. "Mom, this isn't something that can be fixed. Not anymore." She looked torn, but finally, she nodded, understanding that this was the only way. I squeezed her hand, a silent promise that we'd be okay. Madison and I walked out together, closing the door on a life that had held us captive for too long. In the weeks that followed, Madison and I focused on rebuilding, leaning on each other as we navigated our newfound freedom. We had to start from scratch, but there was a strange exhilaration in knowing that our lives were finally our own. But the journey wasn't without its complications. We learned from mutual friends that my father had spun his own version of the story to anyone who would listen, painting us as rebellious, ungrateful children who'd abandoned the family. He'd lost much of his influence, but he clung to whatever reputation he could salvage. It hurt to hear the things he was saying, to know he was willing to tarnish our names to protect himself. But I reminded myself that this was the price of freedom, and I was willing to pay it. One evening, Madison and I were having dinner when my phone buzzed with a message. It was from my mother. "I'm leaving him." The words hit me like a jolt. I showed Madison, and we both stared at the screen, barely believing what we were reading. My mother, after years of loyalty and quiet suffering, was finally walking away. A few days later, she showed up at my apartment, looking fragile but resolute. "I should have done this years ago," she said, her voice wavering. "I'm sorry I didn't protect you both sooner." We hugged her, all of us feeling a bittersweet relief. It was a messy, painful resolution, but it was also a new beginning, a chance to rebuild, to find peace without the shadow of my father looming over us. Months later, life was different. It wasn't easy, and we had to make sacrifices, but there was a lightness to everything now, a sense of possibility. Madison pursued her dreams without the pressure of a forced marriage, and I finally started my outdoor adventure business, knowing it was my own choice, my own future. As for my father, I heard rumors that his business was struggling, that his carefully constructed empire was beginning to show cracks. Part of me felt a pang of sadness for him, for the man who'd chosen power over family. But I knew that was his choice, just as leaving had been ours. In the end, we each made our own path, our own choice. And while our family would never be the same, we'd found something far more valuable, the strength to live on our own terms, free from the weight of someone else's expectations.